Okay, I think we may start because, okay, we are now live on Facebook. Good day to everybody. My name is Gabriele Boccaccini. I'm professor of Second Temple Judaism and Christian Origins at the University of Michigan and founding director of Enoch Seminar. Together with the vice directors Kelly Koblenz-Bauch and Lawrence Tuchenbrook and all members and friends of the Enoch Seminar, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you. This is the third major online event organized this year by the Enoch Seminar. The first was in June on concept of evil in Second Temple Judaism, followed in October by a conference on the Aramaic Enoch, in collaboration with the University of Lublin, Poland. Stay tuned because other events will follow next year, 2021, a conference on John the Baptist in January 11-14, in collaboration with the Journal for the Study of Historical Jesus, the Enoch Graduate Seminar in late April, and a conference on Jewish apocalypticism in May, in collaboration with the University of Munich, Germany. And then in November, the fifth Enoch Seminar Colloquium on Luke Acts. So you see, we have already a very busy schedule for the year 2021. Hundreds of participants have joined our events. For this event too, we have gathered a very large group of participants, several hundreds. We are pleased to offer this opportunity of meeting to people from all over the world. As you know, there is no registration fee. We would like to keep our online events free of charge, but in order to cover our expenses, we need some voluntary support. Donations of $20 or more are very much appreciated. I would like to thank those who already did that, and you can find detailed instructions on the For Enoch website, how to make donation through the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies that is supporting the activities of the Enoch Seminar. This is our fourth Enoch Seminar Colloquium. In 2017, we met at Harvard University in person on Jewish apocalypticism. In 2018, we discussed the Jewishness of Paul at the Denver SPL meeting. Last year, 2019, it seems 1 century ago, we were in person in San Diego, California, dealing with the problem of anti-Jewishness in the Gospel of John. Next year in November, we'll discuss Luke Acts within Second Temple Judaism. Preparation is already on its way. This year, we have two major events during these 2 days of colloquium. Tomorrow, we will have a one-day conference on the place of the Gospel of Matthew within the diversity of Second Temple Judaism, as well as within the diversity of the early Jesus movement. You are all invited to join us. Today, we host a book presentation of the volume, A Guide of Early Jewish Text and Traditions in Christian Transmission, edited by Alexander Kulik with Gabriele Boccaccini, Lorenzo Di Tommaso, David Amidovich, and Michael Stone, published in 2019 by Oxford University Press. The presentation will be followed by an online reception of the Enoch Seminar at 2:30 after a break, to which you are again all invited. Today, this is an amazingly rich book, the result of a very ambitious project. When I was a student nobody, at least in Italy, was talking of reception history. The attitude at the time was to see reception history almost as an unknown obstacle to the reconstruction of the original meaning of a document, something that separated us from the original setting of a document and had to be removed to unearth its original meaning. Reception history was not understood as a means to better understand the nature of the documents. I would like to provide only one example, just to give an idea of the progress that has been made. In 2001, George Nickelsburg, in his monumental commentary on First Enoch, offered a detailed analysis of all aspects of the document, yet he devoted only a very brief paragraph to reception history of the document in the early modern period, when First Enoch was lost to Judaism and Mediterranean Christianity, until he reappears in the West when James Bruce returned to Europe in 1773 with 3 Ethiopic manuscripts. Now, thanks to this book, the reader can trace in detail the reception history of the document in the different languages in which Enochic tradition were transmitted: Ethiopic, Greek, but also Syriac and Arabic. The Book of Enoch might be lost, but Enochic traditions were very much alive in theology, liturgy, alchemy, literature. In addition to the 3 manuscripts brought back by Bruce, other manuscripts played an important role in Europe. 2 of them were attributed to Enoch, even though they were not, but they were believed to be so by Piccolo Mirandola in the 15th century and Pierrec in France in the 17th century. And another manuscript, now at the Vatican Library, circulated in Rome, and we just recently discovered that this manuscript also came from Bruce, who donated it to the Pope. Yet, as all groundbreaking books, this is only the first step. There are many things that need to be done, many voices to be listened to, many aspects to be covered. It is like a Pandora box. Anytime that there is a groundbreaking work, there is always something more that we discover should be done and will be done. My expectation in this meeting is that the conversation will highlight the many accomplishments of this volume and also indicate new perspectives of research. It is only the beginning. The best is yet to come. It is with the spirit that I now leave the floor to Alexander Kulik, the editor-in-chief of the project, for his opening remarks. Thank you, Alexander, and you'll be chairing now this session.
Thank you so much, Gabriele, for this introduction and for all you've done for this project, the ELEX seminar. Done for it. Good evening to everybody in the Eastern Hemisphere, and good morning in America. Happy Veterans Day, the Armistice Day, or le jour de souvenir, wherever you are. As Michael reminded us, it's 102nd anniversary. And we have presented here a guide of early Jewish texts and traditions in Christian transmission, published by the Oxford University Press earlier this year. We'll start with brief introductions by our editors, then we'll have 3 review papers or talks connected to our topic by colleagues not involved in the project, followed by 3 brief responses by some of our volume contributors. And we'll finish with a general discussion open for all the participants of this meeting. And this part, as I understand, will be chaired by Gabriele. At any time during the session, you have the opportunity to contribute to the discussion by submitting your brief comments to the entire group through the chat function located at the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Once we open the floor for discussion, you may also use the raised hand function to signal your willingness to contribute. The chair will call on you as time allows, and in this case, you'll become happily visible and potentially unmuted. I'm very excited to present this volume, which is fruit of hands of the many and good. I had a fantastic team, editors and authors, to whom I'm deeply grateful. We started this project roughly 6.5 years ago, and assembling most our authors in quiet seclusion of Phoenician Dor, located on the narrow strip between the Carmel Ridge and Hayam Acharon, known to some as Mare Nostrum, a Roman lake. We landed there in order to try to figure out how we can reverse an image of the early Jewish literature by bringing its transmission and preservation modes to the forefront. The format we have chosen for doing so was conditioned by two main considerations. First, we aimed, as said, to reverse a perspective, or if you wish, to introduce a certain balance into scholarly perspectives on early Jewish literature. We felt a need to eventually answer a call of old and consider this corpus not from the point of view of a reconstructed product, that is a body of hypothetical, unpreserved originals, as usually portrayed in accordance with the agenda of specific religious-centric disciplines, but rather from the point of view of the extant evidence, thus in a more philologically oriented framework. We wanted to remind ourselves that we see the early Jewish literature, quoting Paul in Corinthians 13:12, not face to face, but through a glass darkly. This does not necessarily mean that we hold a hypercritical view on the possibility of such hypothetical reconstructions. Not at all. At least speaking on behalf of myself, I'm quite open for all kinds of wishful thinking, especially in regards of a research object so dear to my heart as early Jewish literature. So we simply agreed in recognizing that such an integral survey was lacking, and that we need to fill this lacuna in order to initiate a process of bridging the gap between scholars of early Judaism and medieval Christianity. Our second consideration was the following. One finds much research pertaining to each distinct linguistic and ecclesiastic tradition and corpus, as well as some intertraditional insights here and there. But what we are missing, and this is most significant, is a systematic dialogue among scholars who are, quite understandably, often restricted to their own particular fields and to sources preserved in languages that they have mastered. In our view, this dialogue should commence with the presentation of the state of the field, that is, a general survey of the research situation documented in a reference volume. Our volume was designed to yield just such a result, and to take the most necessary step of providing a basic platform, a map for discussion, and a useful tool for scholars of various disciplines, approaches, and backgrounds. Believe me, it was easier to proclaim than to achieve, and I'm fully aware that we only made the first step in this direction. Our volume does not provide a methodological closure to this huge topic. It only opens it. And I'll finish by saying that the present volume shares one trait with its object of research. It has been conceived and implemented by a diverse team whose members belong to different fields of knowledge and were not then to rival schools of thought. And if neither of these, then they at least hold opposing views on most cardinal issues. Although such diversity may come at the expense of uniformity of presentation, we chose to view that not as an inevitable constraint dictated by the hitherto disciplinary disintegration of the topic, but as a fundamental advantage of this project, which exposes the reader to a richness of views and approaches. And now I give the floor to other editors. Lorenzo?
Let's follow the order. Lorenzo, maybe you can start.
Yeah, alphabetically, probably. Yeah.
Alphabetically, then Gabriella, you.
I already introduced her, so I will do it then.
No problem. Well, I have very little to add to Alexander's insightful comments. and what are already printed in the introduction to the volume, other than maybe rather than comments on methodology or purpose, really on some comments on what this volume actually does. This is essentially a specialist volume. And in that way, it's designed for specialists and has both a prospective and a retrospective outlook. But when I say specialists, I think it must be, on the other hand, remembered that this category is extremely broad indeed. As Alexander said, it encompasses specialists from a wide variety of disciplines or field areas. It also covers the historical spectrum from biblical studies to scholars of early Judaism, specialists in early Christianity, late antiquity, the early medieval period, and also the early Byzantine period. And of course, not just those periods, but also the cultures or the cultural ecologies within those periods. At the same time, it embraces many linguistic cultural traditions and also assesses the evidence on the basis of other heuristic categories. So I think it's important to realize that this volume, as Gabriella quite rightly said, it's not the last word on the subject. It was never meant to be. But what it was a way to tie up or to bring together, perhaps, the various threads, the various currents of research in a very, very broad topic, on a very, very broad topic, to bring them together and to bring them together under the umbrella of one volume, and to ask its contributors to sum up the state of knowledge on this subject, and also to look forward to maybe to propose some questions or bring to light some issues that still need to be addressed. Again, it's not comprehensive, but it is as comprehensive as I think, or very close to it, as we can be now. So I think I'll leave my comments at that point.
Thank you so much.
I think, David, you're next.
Yeah, do you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Good morning for somebody, and good night for Francis. Thank you, Alexander, again, to invite me to be one of the editors of the volume. It's a great honor for me, and also to contribute at this volume. What I would like to say very, very quickly is that just to say, after the reading of the volume as a whole, that's very interesting to me to catch the difficulty to see exactly what does it mean, transmission of a writing or of our tradition. And probably if we want to speak at what moment about some methodological issue or some different approaches, maybe it could be interesting to study more carefully the role of the manuscript to be able to catch different way, to have a clear view of what kind of transmission it is. So probably I think this volume is very interesting because also he gathers some views, some approaches, but also he raises new question about how to catch or to see the way to understand what does it mean, a transition of some writing or traditions. And that's very, very interesting to see the volume as a whole for that also. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I will give now the lead to Gabriele.
Well, Michael.
Oh, Michael before, okay. Oh, Michael.
Unmute yourself, please. Michael?
I know that's what I was doing.
Sorry.
I suffer from a disability here in that I haven't seen the book. My copies apparently have got lost somewhere with a lame camel crossing the Atlantic Ocean or something. So I'm speaking from having seen my own and one or two other contributions only that I read in an editorial capacity. And I want to thank Alexander for getting me into this, particularly because it has made the set of questions I have to ask have made me change my emphasis a little bit. Up to fairly recently, I've been busy on my Armenian side, and this is a side that's expressed in that volume, I've been busy simply with the fact that most of the texts have never been seen outside a manuscript. So it's been a matter of transcription, translation, what I call learned layman's commentary, because we're nowhere near places where we can do a deep commentary, and just the task of getting the material out. The series that I've been working on has 4 volumes out, 5 volumes out, or there will be one in the press, and it's held up because of Corona with the SBL. Another one finished, and yeah, so there's been a lot of volumes of just the series of Apocrypha, but there's also volumes of apocryphal texts with different titles. Now I'm being forced by the questions that we posed in the Voice of Jacob project to ask, how do these different documents function? Why are they the way they are? Why are they in this shape? Which means going and asking a lot of questions about the shape of the Armenian tradition itself. What's happening there? Why do we have 50 books of Adam and Eve in Armenian? 50 different documents. Why do we have a dozen or 15 about Abraham? And so on. So I'm really now moving from keeping the text editing in minor key and trying to think more about these second order of discourse questions about the origins, the function, and so on. And of course, I'm trying to put the things in the context of the traditions that we can follow in from Second Temple period on. Lorenzo already ad-numbrated all the periods. So they're small languages as well, but we didn't get them all quite in the volume, Sasha. Nearly. So that's what I have to say about it. And it was very important for me personally. So thank you. Thank you, Alexander, for stimulating me. Thank you all for being patient.
Well, thank you, Michael. And thank you to all the editors. We really behaved. It was really fast and we have enough time for discussion. And now we switch to our reviewers, and we start with James Coogan.
Can everybody hear me? I hope.
We hear you well, Jim.
My thanks to the organizers of this Zoom meeting for having invited me to participate. I have to say I'm always surprised if I actually manage to make it on Zoom. I've often thought there ought to be a kind of rabbinic prayer of gratitude one recites, you know, Osei Niflaot Gedolot or something like that, when it actually works. I've been teaching with Zoom all this last semester, and often I've been surprised at not getting through. But anyway, my thanks to the organizers of this meeting for having invited me to participate. I'm joining you from Jerusalem, which is 7 hours ahead of Eastern Standard Time, though there doesn't seem to be any particular standard time that everybody's from. In my case, if you see me yawn from time to time, it's not out of disrespect or boredom, but just the waning of, for me, a long day. In any case, at the suggestion of the management, I intend to speak briefly today, not about the book under discussion per se, that is a guide to early Jewish texts and traditions in Christian transmission, but about a question underlying this volume, namely, why did Judaism, specifically Rabbinic Judaism, end up not preserving many earlier Jewish writings of the Second Temple period, while these same writings were indeed taken up later by Christians? I suppose an answer must begin with the whole matter of canonization of scripture, and one aspect in particular, namely the predominant place of the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, as Judaism's central text. I don't wish to debate when or why this happened, but I hope we can agree that at a certain early point it did happen, so that the Pentateuch or Torah became and remains to this day the central written text of Judaism. But the very predominance raised by the question of Israel's other preserved writings comes to the fore. What ought to be kept along with the Pentateuch, if anything, as part of Israel's sacred library? As I'm sure everyone knows here, this was a question that inspired some debate and came to be resolved in different ways in different communities. The Second Temple period books at the heart of this volume, of the volume under discussion, today had a strange career. They were excluded from the rabbinic biblical canon, but ended up being preserved and transmitted in what we are agreeing to call Christian circles. The writings so transmitted were of great variety. They include books like 1 and 2 Enoch and Jubilees and Judith, and the Book of Biblical Antiquities, the Apocalypse of Abraham. Don't need to go through the whole list, I'm sure it's familiar to you. One might indeed ask why and how these works were ultimately excluded by Rabbinic Judaism. Were they ever in contention? Why couldn't some of them have been included, or at least not excluded, under some rubric like deuterocanonical compositions? Such questions don't all, within Judaism, such questions don't all have the same answers. Some of the texts just mentioned must have seemed to the rabbis to contain historical errors or otherwise contradict the rabbis' established traditions. Some of them were at odds with doctrines or practices that differed from those of the rabbis. Some were of questionable origin and or content, fake news from the rabbi's point of view. But certainly the exclusion of these earlier works had a great deal to do with the very emergence of Rabbinic Judaism and its particular program in later times. If, for example, you were to ask Rabbi Akiva in the 2nd century of the Common Era whether it was acceptable for his students to study the Book of Jubilees, he would be surprised, actually here in the manuscript I had originally written, apoplectic, at the question on 2 counts. First, Jubilees espouses a halakha opposed in many particulars to the halachic rulings of Rabbinic Judaism. Jubilees is, for example, based on a calendar different from the lunisolar calendar that the rabbis endorsed. The manner of Jubilees observance of the biblical festivals was markedly different from that of the rabbis. Its rules for keeping the Sabbath conflicted with the rabbinic rules. It contains specific interpretations of Pentateuchal narratives that were in conflict with rabbinic interpretations, and so on and so on. In addition to this objection, however, Rabbi Akiva would probably add another broader consideration. Why should anyone need to look beyond the Pentateuch itself and our other long-established ancient texts, including in this group at Rabbi Akiva's own insistence, incidentally, King Solomon's divinely revealed Song of Songs? Why should anyone seek to go beyond this exclusive coterie? A Jew ought to spend his or her waking hours studying and carrying out God's commandments. Beyond this, I would like to point out 2 things about the Second Temple period text under discussion that might not be immediately apparent. The first is the fact that in the books under discussion, halakha, that is biblical law and its application and extension in everyday life, is remarkable by its absence in the texts under consideration. True, there are exceptions, such as just noted in the Book of Jubilees, which is indeed quite interested in certain matters of halakha, or for another example, the priestly halakha sections of the Aramaic Levi document, and thence more or less to the testament of Levi in the testaments of the 12 patriarchs. But for the most part, the authors of these Second Temple period texts had other things in mind. Genesis, I should mention, is the only book of the Pentateuch that is not full of divine laws and statutes. And it is certainly no accident that many of these excluded Second Temple period books are concerned specifically with figures and tales from the book of Genesis. The second thing I wish to point out in general about these excluded Second Temple texts is that they are full of ancient biblical interpretation, but in a form that is not immediately identified as such. In general, I should mention that ancient biblical interpretation is different from modern reckonings with the Bible, not only in the new methods that modern scholars can bring to the task, but as well in the scope of ancient versus modern biblical scholarship. Ancient biblical interpretation was generally not concerned with the overall message of this or that story or the nature of one or another character in biblical narratives. Rather, ancient biblical interpretation was usually addressed to the meaning of a single individual verse or even just one or two specific words within it. Why this narrow focus? For the most part, ancient biblical interpretation was concerned with perceived problems in the biblical text. For example, something that appeared to have been omitted or was otherwise in need of explanation, or a reference to or place name no longer understood, or an apparent contradiction between this verse and another. So to mention a few specifics about which ancient interpreters asked, they asked, how did Cain die? Cain, of course, had murdered his brother, Abel, but his own death is never reported in Genesis. Or another question, in introducing Melchizedek, why doesn't the Torah give his full name, Melchizedek, the son of so-and-so? This was the usual form of a full name in biblical times. Or for another example, why did Genesis, in recounting Jacob's dream of the ladder stretching from earth to heaven, mention that there were some angels ascending and descending on it? What was the significance, their significance in the dream? They don't seem to mean anything that we're told about. Or finally, what did Potiphar's wife mean by saying that Joseph had been brought to us, in quotes, to dally with us in the plural? In context, she seems to be talking only about herself, but then the royal we is very rare in Hebrew. To answer such questions, ancient interpreters, or at least ancient writers reporting on the interpreters' answers, didn't typically first state the question and then offer their answer directly. There are some exceptions, Philo's Quaestiones, for example, or Qumran Pesher, or for that matter, later on in rabbinic compilations of Midrash. But for the most part, ancient interpreters simply retold the text in such a way as to include their own answer to the implied question. The result was a revised, somewhat expanded version of Scripture's words, revised so as to include the interpreter's explanation of the problematic verse or words. Such little expansions are a common feature of the Aramaic Targums and other translations. They are found in whole books like Jubilees or the Genesis Apocryphon from Qumran, or the anonymous book of biblical antiquities, as well as in sermons, prayers, and offhand references of various other sorts. So, for example, the book of Jubilees tells us the manner of Cain's death omitted in Genesis. His stone house collapsed on him, killing him at once. The author of Jubilees notes that this was only proper since Cain had killed Abel with a stone, so that not only was Abel's death punished by Cain's death, but both came about with the same instrument, a stone or stones. This in turn was important to the author of Jubilees because it seemed to anticipate the commandment of Leviticus 24:17. The injury that was inflicted on a person shall be inflicted, the person that was inflicted on a person shall be inflicted in the same way on him. As for Melchizedek's last name, he was, according to Targum Neophiti, for example, none other than Shem, son of Noah. That was his true and full name, but apparently he had also been given the title of Melchizedek, which was construed to mean righteous king. With regard to the angels in Jacob's dream, there were exactly 4 of them ascending and descending on the ladder. They represented the 4 empires, Babylon, Persia, Media, Greece, and Rome, who would rise up to oppress Israel, but would eventually fall again. This is traditions found in Vayikra Rabbah and perhaps earlier as well in the Slavonic ladder of Jacob. And Potiphar's wife was speaking in the plural because she wanted her testimony against Joseph to be backed up by other ladies in the court. This apparently was first put forward by Philo of Alexandria. But I mention all this because a funny thing happened to such narrative expansions. They may have been created to answer exegetical questions, but the fact that they took the form of little insertions into the rewritten narrative proved crucial, because after a while, their exegetical function came to be obscured. They were now considered simply to be part of biblical history, and that had, for some mysterious reason, been omitted from the book of Genesis. This is what is called the legendization of ancient biblical interpretation. Its exegetical purpose was forgotten, but the narrative expansions lived on, now seeming to be independent legends in their own right. And as such, these legends ended up as part of the raw material used in the books under discussion today. I should mention here that it sometimes was not a matter of forgetting the original exegetical purpose, but rather the inability to translate it into another language. That is to say, in many cases, the exegesis was lost because the readers in question were not reading the text in Hebrew. So to return to a biblical passage cited earlier, readers probably wouldn't understand that when Jesus spoke of the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man in John 1:51, the text was alluding to a certain ambiguity in Genesis 28:12, which says that the angels in Jacob's dream were ascending and descending bo, which in Hebrew could mean that they were ascending and descending on it, the ladder, or on him, Jacob. That point would be lost in Greek because the Greek word for ladder, klimax, is feminine in gender, while in Hebrew, sulam, ladder, and consequently the pronoun bo, on it or on him, are masculine. To return to my point, these bits of biblical interpretation came to be legendized and were no longer seen as biblical interpretation at all. I should add that legendization is not a phenomenon of early Christianity alone. It was common as well in rabbinic midrash. Whatever the cause, precisely because of their legendization, these little narrative expansions were easily incorporated into the Second Temple period texts under discussion. They are to be found, for example, in the book of Judith, which you would probably not expect, the Life of Adam and Eve, book of biblical intent. I won't read the whole list. Let me add one final consideration in connection with the overall question I'm trying to answer. Why did Rabbinic Judaism end up excluding all these wonderful Jewish writings of Second Temple times? Because I think it has to be observed that in some degree, Rabbinic Judaism didn't exclude them at all. Some of these Second Temple periods were indeed known and studied. Ben Sira, for example, despite the well-known prohibitions of doing so found in Mishnah Yadayim 3:7, and quite explicitly with regard to Ben Sira in Tosefta 2:13. In spite of what these passages say, Rabbinic Jews themselves lovingly preserved Ben Sira's words in their prayers that they were writing and other writings. The book of Ben Sira is cited, sometimes by name, in Rabbinic Midrash and in the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. I should add that while Rabbinic Judaism was sometimes unrelenting in seeking to establish the party line on one or another narrative. Sometimes the rabbis slipped up, particularly with regard to liturgical poetry. Perhaps precisely because it was poetry, the mammoth Yom Kippur Avodah, recently pieced together by Yosef Yahalom, has been found to include exegetical themes otherwise known to us only from sectarian writings. Apparently, those writings continued to be studied long after the hegemony of rabbinic exegesis was established. What is more, as time went on, rabbinic Judaism seems to have relaxed its grip somewhat. The medieval Midrashic compilation, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, seems bent on evoking motifs from the Second Temple period writings we're talking about. And as Martha Himmelfarb has amply demonstrated in her research and summarized well in her contribution to the present volume, later Jewish writings such as Sefer Yosipon, Midrash Agadah, Bereshit Rabbati, the Chronicles of Yerachmiel, and others display a familiarity with some of the excluded Second Temple period writings under discussion. So just to summarize, why didn't later Jews of the rabbinic variety preserve the early Second Temple compositions named above? I'll mention the 5 principal reasons. First come the ideological and other differences that separated rabbinic Judaism from many of these Second Temple compositions. They were of sufficient number and importance to make those works unacceptable to the rabbis. Second, rabbinic Judaism's overriding concern with halakha, pursued in the study house and applied in daily life, at least in theory, let little room, intellectual and physical, for studying these other texts. 3, the Second Temple period writings include bits of biblical interpretation, but not in such a way as to be identified as such. Legendized, they must therefore have seemed to rabbinic sages to be free-floating inventions tacked on to the book of Genesis. 4, the alternate universe of halakha-based texts in Hebrew and Aramaic, running from Mishnah and Tosefta and the so-called halachic midrashim onto the 2 Talmuds and still later halachic writings, could scarcely admit these earlier texts to the inner sanctum of scripture and authorized scriptural exegesis. And finally, 5, despite all of the above, this Second Temple period literature was not entirely lost after all to rabbinic Judaism. It was still in the air in individual cases like Ben Sira, and it seems to have undergone something of a revival in medieval times. That's all I wrote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. And the next talks we have Liv Ingeborg-Lied from the Norwegian School of Theology. Liv.
Hi, thank you. So I would like to start my response by thanking the organizers for inviting me, and I would also like to express my gratitude to the editors and the contributors for all the work they have put into the volume. It has already been helpful to me, and I am convinced that it will continue to be helpful to others as well. So let me point out one major reason why the Guide to Early Jewish Texts and Traditions in Christian Transmission matters. It offers in a single volume an overview of important parts of the transmission history of early Jewish texts in Christian linguistic/ecclesiastical traditions. So some parts were known already, but this is the first time that an integrated survey of these proportions has been made available in one dedicated publication. And I really want to acknowledge the surplus value of this endeavor. The volume creates a new and accessible picture of the range and wealth and complexity of this transmission history, and thus creates an opportunity for the field of early Jewish studies to explore some of the broad strokes of its empirical, methodological, and epistemological makeup. So in the following, I want to raise 2 issues. The first is brief and critical. The second issue takes the shape of a longer reflection and is more of a discussion point. I would like to think with you about the contribution of the volume and how it may help point out a direction for future scholarship. So my first issue is critical. It concerns gender. The editors of the guide are all male. The guide contains 26 entries and a general introduction. One single entry is authored by a woman, and that is Martha Himmelfarb's Rabbinic and Post-Rabbinic Jewish. As you all know, so-called manthologies and menals and festicles have received some negative attention lately, and it is only Himmelfarb's important contribution that saves the guide from falling into this category. Now, there is no doubt that during the last century, most of the scholars that engaged the issue of Christian transmission of early Jewish texts were men. But already in the 1990s, and particularly during the last 2 decades, many women scholars have taken part in the debate, and many of them are major players, bringing new perspectives to the field. And note now that I'm not asking the editors how this had happened. I'm not asking for explanations. Instead, I would like the editors to share some reflections about the finished product. Regardless of what the reasons were, the fact remains that the guide has only one female contributor. How does this matter, and how does it reflect back upon the guide? So my second issue concerns the output of the volume. At the very first page of the general introduction, Alexander Kulik highlights that the intellectual curiosity in the transmission of early Jewish texts as a, and I quote, methodologically fascinating object of research, unquote, unites the scholars that contribute to the volume. The situation that makes it fascinating is, and I quote again, the fact that the absolute majority of the evidence about one civilization, early Judaism, has been preserved by another, late antique and medieval Christianity, creates an intricate set of challenges that overlap diverse academic disciplines, yet are complexly intertwined. In this introductory move, Kulik links the focus of the project that materializes in the guide to an issue that has been acknowledged at least since 1909 and which has been actively debated since the early 1970s. In short, this debate points out that the large majority of the texts and traditions scholars explore as early and Jewish are only preserved in later manuscripts produced by and for Christian communities. Now, in 2020, this debate and its main arguments are known to most active scholars in the field, thanks to the scholarship of, among others, Michael Stone and Robert Kraft. However, although broadly acknowledged as a methodological challenge, with some exceptions, the academic practices in the field have not changed. The reflections that the debate promotes are still far too often held hostage in a corner of the introductory chapter without affecting the rest of the analysis in a given publication. So what does this look like in the guide? Do the contributors obey Kulik's methodological call to arms? And yes, a decent share of the entries should be commended precisely for not allowing this methodological issue to languish in the corner of the introduction. Exemplary in the first section of the guide, A, Traditions, is Jacques van der Vliet's essay on Coptic traditions. This entry manages to bring methodological issues explicitly to the forefront. And the way he performs his analysis shows that the methodological reflections have become integral to the research, stressing the relevant issues of the tradition he is exploring. In section B, Corpora, I would like to highlight Lorenzo di Tommaso's essay. This essay balances a discussion of the history of the scholarly category of pseudepigrapha with a methodological reflection about what this category has produced and continues to produce. Now, although this contribution is very valuable in its own right, its focus on the academic construct, pseudepigrapha, exemplifies a partial problem in section B. The general introduction of the volume signals that the section is to explore corpora from the point of view of the Christian transmission. However, such a section would in fact look quite different, and I would be happy to return to this during the Q&A. Section C, comparative perspectives, contain high quality contributions throughout, and I learned a lot from reading them. The problem arises for me in section D, Trajectories of Traditions. This section contains 2 entries. The latter entry is a bibliography of the reception of Old Testament figures. It is helpful in its own right, but it remains a bibliography. The first entry is James Charlesworth's The Pseudepigrapha Crescent and a taxonomy of how Christians shape Jewish traditions and texts. Charlesworth's contribution concerns pseudepigrapha only, which means that it only deals with parts of the larger range of materials that have been explored in the volume. And also, the theoretical and methodological reflections in this entry are not up to date or wide-ranging enough to represent any lasting advance. In other words, in my view, the guide lacks a crucial chapter or maybe two. Section D would have been the perfect place for a contribution that would have pinpointed what the outcome of bringing together the large materials that are represented in the guide is. It would also be the place for a theoretical contribution that would help us synthesize and reflect on the main features, as well as on the consequences of the finds for ongoing academic practice. The fact that this does not happen is a lost opportunity. And please allow me to add that some of the women who are active in the field would have been perfect candidates for the task. These scholars have done and are currently doing groundbreaking work on the epistemological and methodological aspects of the debate on the Christian transmission of early Jewish texts and traditions, and it could have benefited the guide at this point. Since this proposed chapter does not exist, I would love to spend the last part of this response to think with you about what it is the guide shows and could have spelled out. Now, when we have access to a larger picture in a single volume, what is it that we see now that we didn't see before? My reflections in the following can be summarized in terms of three keywords. It's access, priorities, and representation. Access. The long-standing discussion about the methodological challenges of exploring early Jewish texts in Christian transmission is to a large degree a discussion about access. This discussion acknowledges that the study of early Jewish texts depend on the media and the mediating practices of later Christian communities. In other words, there are things we need to know about our sources. The group of entries in section A creates an aggregated picture of what we are up against. First, many of the manuscripts that serve as our sources to early Jewish writings are younger, sometimes much younger than the texts scholars of early Judaism set out to explore. This point is well known already, but in the guide, we can efficiently see how this plays out in a variety of linguistic traditions. The guide may help the field to mind the gap and to signpost issues of temporal and geographical distance, issues of translation, and the many things that may happen when the reproduction and multiplication of texts require manual copying. It may also help us see that the transmission that ensures the survival of the text and traditions is entangled with the agency and cultural practices of the communities that preserve them. In other words, as William Adler has pointed out, the texts that have come down to us are the received texts, and it is difficult, perhaps impossible, to disentangle the hypothetical text from the received text and the communities that kept them. Second, many of the texts the guide bring up are what I will call embedded texts. Embedded texts are texts that are not available as separate documents copied as distinct layout units in a manuscript. Rather, they are represented as works in another literary work. We know them by mention through a brief description or assumed citations in these other works. Several of the entries in the guide treat such texts. Primary among them is Volker Siegert's Minor Jewish Hellenistic Authors. It has been common in the field to conceptualize and to study many of these texts in terms of independent works that once existed. It is possible that this is correct, but on many occasions that is impossible to know. What we have access to are embedded texts integral to another literary work, and many of them may never have circulated as anything else than that, which does not make them less interesting, but suggests that they are another animal. Third, we need to keep in mind that a large part of the products of the historical transmission processes are lost. We do not have access to any comprehensive picture. The transmission of early Jewish texts and traditions has probably been multimedial, written, figurative, oral, performed, memorized, etc. And many of these media left no traces for us to explore. Furthermore, although surviving Christian manuscripts contain copies of what is presumably early Jewish texts, we have access only to snapshots of a larger circulation. And simultaneously, we also have to remember that although we depend mainly on these Christian manuscripts for access to discrete writings, autonomously circulating excerpts, narrative clusters, and tropes have a much larger and more varied transmission in ways in which I think we have yet to fully understand. Priorities. Traditionally, the field of early Jewish studies has invited us to explore origins. Although the sources we have available are copies and later Christian manuscripts, the field still encourages us to study the early Jewish faith, to which we have no direct access. The manuscripts are admittedly sources primarily to the communities that produced and engaged them. We are the ones who want to use them to explore a text behind them. This is why we have the methodological problem in the first place, and we need to be aware of the practices that follow from this priority and the epistemological challenges they produce. First, as studies of reception history has long pointed out, the earliest phase of a text is only one phase in a longer continuum of circulation and transmission. We can give it priority, but it is not our only option. If we think about text production and transmission as part of such a longer continuum, assumptions of the finished text datable to the early phase are challenged, as are the notion of the sameness that logically underlies the traditional idea and dominant use of manuscripts as witnesses to an early text. This is where our conceptions of change and friction and mediation come into play. This is where our conception, do we assume then that texts go unchanged through transmission to the extent that we can hunt for nuggets of early Jewish traditions in later texts, and I'm paraphrasing van der Vliet here, or trace the threads of unbroken and clean chains of transmission, paraphrasing Di Tommaso. The priority of origins also produces a second epistemological side effect. Starting with the work of Johann Fabricius, William Whiston, Jacques Paul Mignon, M.R. James, and others, the quest for lost books has been integral to the endeavor of establishing a knowledge base and an academic imagination of early Jewish literatures. The ongoing transfer of manuscripts from the Middle East to Europe in the 16th to the 19th century and the important manuscript finds of the 20th century showed that books long thought to be lost could indeed surface, but the same situation may also have generated a discourse about lost books that threatens to create an imagination of the early Jewish library that is out of proportion or potentially not able to grasp the multivalence of the literary imagination. Some of the many texts that survive as embedded texts may once have been extant and materially available book entities. But when we use the conception of lost books on the ethic level to grasp the references to books that appear embedded in a literary work, we may construct books as extant and available that primarily circulated as fictitious books. Representation. As Kulik pointed out in the introduction, evidence about one civilization has been preserved by another. Historically, this is ironically a history of Christian supersessionism, which simultaneously came to ensure the survival of the texts we study. The history of research, which makes up our academic legacy, has made this already complex situation even more complex. In the 19th and 20th century, Protestant and Catholic scholars used the manuscripts of medieval Christian communities, many of them minority communities in the Middle East, to reconstruct an early Judaism that would serve their own interests as a context of Christian origins. The recovery of Jewish past is important in its own right. However, this recovery was complicated both by the explicit goal of many of these scholars and by the fact that they overlooked that they used someone else's manuscripts to meet that goal. The manuscripts were produced by other communities than the ones to which scholars ascribe ownership of the literary work, and scholarly procedures made them invisible as someone else's heritage. The consequences of this practice concern both our methodological reflections and our professional ethics. Scholars have applied the manuscripts for their own purposes at the risk of misrepresenting both the literature of early Judaism and the cultural artifacts of medieval Christian communities. Scholars of early Jewish texts must find a way to face this complexity of a Jewish immaterial and a Christian material heritage. And I'll stop now. There's more on my sheet, but my time is up. So during question and answers, I would be very eager to discuss how we can think about and do research in the following. What are or should be the consequences of the information the guide provides for the field of early Jewish studies? How do we integrate the challenge in our analysis? Or alternatively, can we constructively imagine other kinds of studies, alternative paths and practices of scholarship? In other words, how do we proceed from here? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liv. And now we have Indy Nyman of Oxford to give the third and the last talk in this section. And after that, we'll proceed to a discussion which will be managed by Gabriela, and discussion will be started by the responses of the designated respondents. Hindi, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and also to respond to this volume. I want to begin by characterizing the volume. It's philologically rigorous, it's attentive to matters of material and textual culture, and it's reflective about the historical context out of which these texts have grown and emerged. It's a volume which is at once multilingual, but also pluricultural in its ambitions. The volume begins with an introduction by Alexander Kulik about the nature and categorization of these textual traditions. His introduction is clear and attentive to the nuances that are required by scholars who consider texts that seem to originate in a Jewish context and yet are only or mostly preserved in their textual form in a Christian context. Kulik is very careful not to reduce any of the text to Jewishness, but also and equally does not reduce the text to their received and fully preserved context, namely Christianity. However, the volume as a whole is still negotiating the assumptions and expectations that are now over 2 centuries old with respect to canonical norms, expectations which predate the finding of manuscripts across the past century. I'm talking about the scrolls and of course the Geniza materials, and more generally the expansive collaboration across classics, religious studies and theology, and implications for how we practice our work as scholars. In short, this is an important volume, but in my brief review, I want to emphasize that there's certain assumptions that still need to be rethought for a fair reading of these textual traditions. In my allotted time then, I want to speak about categorization for these ancient and medieval texts, by which I don't mean ancient Jewish and medieval Christian texts, but I mean Jewish and Christian writings writ large. And then I want to talk about implications for our own practices of reading, as well as implications for the ancients who are reading, re-articulating, and performing their own past in a new register. Those of us who have been working on these traditions for many years have been struggling for decades even about what it means to call these texts Christian or Jewish. It is, of course, a very complicated issue. And while I want to raise questions about the title and about the volume more generally, of course, I understand, sympathize, and identify with the editors and with the contributors that whatever title was settled on, it was going to be imperfect. Our contemporary naming practices can never achieve everything that they are intended to achieve. I've reflected on this a little bit with Iber Tichler about the naming of scrolls, for example, in the first generation of scrolls scholarship. In any event, most of these texts are produced at a time when Judaism and Christianity are what I called in 1999 intimately separate with respect to these earlier traditions. But it's also the case that Jewishness and Jewish traditions can be said to exist before there's something that we might call Christianity. I use the phrase intimately separate of Philo of Alexandria's writing, but could equally have said this about 1st Enoch, 4th Ezra, among other examples included in this important volume. Part of what I want to offer today is that these texts are intimately connected, not separate. That is, they share many of their interpretations and scriptural starting points. So while I recognize that there's a kind of catharsis involved in calling traditions such as those underlying the Ladder of Jacob or 1st Enoch as Jewish with respect to their own originary moments, it is also the case, and importantly so, that in most cases we don't have the earliest iteration, and even when we do, it's typically fragmentary or assembled from other texts, but at best, it's certainly not an organic whole. But this entire strain of thought is still groping in the dark for texts and for context that we cannot know and we cannot say very much about. So to identify texts as Jewish or Christian is to push them in a direction of a normativity with respect to later forms of Judaism and Christianity. By appropriating the label of Jewish texts as Christian, then, on the other hand, we efface early expressions of Jewishness and Jewish thought, which is at best triumphalist and at worst supersessionist. By taking texts that were shared, saved, transmitted, and transformed by later Christian writers, We are also doing violence to later Christian communities that held these texts as precious and even scriptural in some communities, such as Jubilees or First Enoch. The text has changed since the R.H. Charles collection or James Charlesworth collection or MOTP. It's time, though, I want to say today, to reflect more deeply on what we now know about texts because of, but not restricted to, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Cairo Geniza. It is also the case that we have now collaborated far more extensively with classics as a field, and that many of us are thinking carefully and in intricate ways about cultural influences, productive comparative context for collection, practices of hermeneutics and commentary, as well as new initiatives for the integration of our new texts into old collections. By which I mean our collections, that is, we've constructed new collections, not collections from antiquity. There is an irony, of course, because we construct collections and then we reinforce the boundaries and the margins so that texts and scholars are outliers. Time doesn't permit me here to comprehensively call for the jettisoning of, for example, sectarianism. But it is also the case that terms such as Enochic Judaism, sectarianism, and even Judean, as opposed to Jewish, reinforce disconnections, ruptures, and emphasize an already always parting of the ways, which also can at times reinforce patterns of supersessionism and triumphalism around the recovery of the earlier and purest, most holy layer. The truth is that this volume is essential for thinking about pseudepigraphy from our earliest expression of non-author-based attribution, even Deuteronomy or Isaiah, or later examples such as Paul or Jubilees. But even more than that, we could call upon ourselves to rethink the why and the how of our reconstruction of stomata. The texts are pluriform and often are preserved in a variety of linguistic registers. Additionally, many of these texts are preserved in their best form in the medieval or modern expressions. This means then that we need to rethink our own philological practices, from text critical work to the history of the development of language, as well as literary critical reconstructions of the history of whatever text it is that we're working on. In my own writing, I've coined terms such as progressive editing with respect to Jubilees and the so-called pseudo-Jubilees fragments, traditionary processes with respect to 4th Ezra, and earlier on, I talked about a discourse tied to a founder, drawing on a variety of disciplines outside of our own in order to open up paths that were not yet taken for our assessment, specifically of so-called forgeries, but also of new traditions, that is, new to our field across the last century. As this volume demonstrates time and again, with each text and related tradition comes a world of reception and manuscripts, reading practices, and in most cases, additional texts that are pseudonymously associated with texts, old texts, or figures that we've come to call genuine or historical. So for example, the Apocryphon of Jeremiah or the pseudo-Jubilees fragments have been really rethought, especially, but not only, by the work of Iber Tichelar. These two examples, along with many others, have been called into question across the past decade. We need to rethink the way we make assumptions about a single original text, instead of integrating the knowledge that we have but don't always implement about what I've called the vitality of scripture. It's alive and it's forward moving. These text traditions cannot be frozen in time and then reconstructed across moments along a linear chart. I want to emphasize that part of what I'm calling for is not to think of fixed or whole texts from originary moments, but rather to consider the way these texts have grown over time. These texts are written and continue to grow across cultural and linguistic divides, as this volume beautifully performs. They resist confinement or being circumscribed to particular time or space, which is why I resisted earlier calling it ancient Judaism and medieval Christianity. They continue to be used and invoked across these traditions and also Islam, as well as other traditions. But they also resist linear development or location in a single religious tradition. And here I want to highlight, for example, the work of Lauren Stuckenbrook on Enochic traditions and Jeffrey Kahn in the dynamic and growing nature of the Masoretic traditions. Jews have preserved their own literature in many different ways, again, invoking the question, but they have not necessarily preserved them as whole texts. We can trace elements of interpretation and incorporation of these texts that we come to know as wholly preserved in later Christian communities, but that does not mean that they were no longer Jewish. To be sure, they are also Christian insofar as they become part of Christian liturgical and study traditions. And my plural there on traditions doesn't only speak about Judaism and Christianity. I mean to talk about different strains within Christian tradition as well. Time doesn't permit me to talk about that today. This trajectory of which I speak was started most comprehensively and transformatively by James Coogan, but also in a variety of ways. I'll mention two scholars who've recently contributed to this. One is Judith Newman and Menachem Kister. The question then is, how can we come to understand and appreciate the ways in which these traditions were not only part of a shared origin, but that the very texts themselves continue to have voice across later traditions through liturgy, commentary, copying, and integration from one tradition to another. In other words, to repeat a point that James Coogan already said, Judaism did continue to preserve early Second Temple traditions, but we need another way of charting Nachleben. This is relevant for Philo, for Jubilees, for Enoch, and a whole host of other texts. The incorporation of themes and concepts from literature as early as the Babylonian, Persian, and Hellenistic periods and subsequent literatures and subsequent cultures is all part of the pluriform nature of religious expression within and across religious traditions. This variegated nature is essential to what we come to identify as pluriform, polysemic, and variegated. I would like to see less division or fewer linear accounts and instead focus on the growth and expansion of interpretative traditions and thereby marking the cultural, theological, philological, and hermeneutical changes that take place. The unlocking of these texts requires that we suspend the labels of Jewish or Christian, but also that we refrain from calling the texts that we feel don't fit or don't map on what we consider to be Jewish or Christian now as Judean or sectarian, and other such labels that we construct out of our own assumptions and expectations that are retrospectively imposed in antiquity. And there's a brand new book by Arjen Bakker who has a full chapter about how to problematize sectarianism in the context of the scrolls and beyond, called The Secret of Time. How then do we do the work as philologists, as interpreters, and as historians? How do we inevitably carry our own biases into the past and judge the work as peripheral or essential to the formation of interpretative communities? And how can we own up to that in our own scholarship? Here, I want to reiterate Liv Leeds' important critique about what more we could have achieved with methodological reflection and updating some of the current scholarship and innovation in the bibliographies in this book and in the discussion in our own field and in cognate fields. How might we rethink our own biases and expectations about the original text and original language, about reconstructing the first expression, and how we imagine the growth and dynamic vitality of traditions without confining those traditions to later theological frameworks and expectations? In this reflection on classical philology, both in Greek and in Hebrew, is precisely what I had in mind when I spoke of ethical reading in 2016. We thank the editors and contributors for a comprehensive and intensely collaborative contribution, both to ancient Jewish and to ancient Christian literature, and into our ongoing study of pseudepigrapha and ancient Jewish literature and early Christianity, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, for inspiring new critique of our established categories so that we can reopen these texts for ourselves and for our own students as we continue to understand the complexity and intimate connectedness with less emphasis on separateness today. And this is for today and also for the future of our shared enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Indy. And now, Gabriela. Don't hear you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like, on behalf of the entire seminar, to thank Alexander Kulik and the editors of the volumes and the three panelists for these excellent presentations. Now our live broadcast on Facebook ends, and our discussion will continue on Zoom.